Hi class, I wanted to give you guys a short video to go along with your aggregate supply, aggregate demand practice worksheet that we have. We can start by looking at our textbook in chapter 11. A few important terms that are going to help us understand different economic perspectives are classical or neoclassical economists. So these are economists who believe in Say's law, which we're essentially saying these economists say to help the economy grow and expand, we really need to be focusing on the supply side of the economy. So Say's law is that supply creates its own demand. So essentially, in 2004, none of us wanted iPhones because iPhones did not exist. Once the iPhone did exist and supply was there, demand followed right along. So classical economists or neoclassical economists, these new classical economists, still believe that we should emphasize focusing on the supply side of the economy. Keynesian economists, on the other hand, believe in putting an emphasis on the demand side. So if you notice in the reading, Keynes never actually said demand creates its own supply, but it gives us this picture of really focusing on the demand side. Beyonce did not drop her last album on cassette tape because none of us are demanding cassette tapes. So they're not producing cassette tapes. And so Keynes is also has a more focus, more emphasis on, if the economy is doing poor, using demand to stimulate the growth of the economy, whereas classicals want to use supply to stimulate the growth of the economy. So let's grab our worksheet. We're going to talk about how do we read and interpret the ASAD model, and then also what happens in the world to cause changes, how would a classical economist solve the problem, and how would a Keynesian economist solve the problem. So what will shift our aggregate demand curve? So we actually learned a lot about aggregate demand when we did chapter 6, and we talked about the expenditures approach to calculating GDP, which said GDP equals household consumption, gross domestic private investment, business spending, government consumption expenditures, and also net exports, which we know is exports minus imports. So if any of those things, I'll just fill that in real quick, if any of those things change, it will shift our aggregate demand curve. So if households increase their spending, aggregate demand curve will increase. We know that's a shift out and to the right. If businesses increase their spending, maybe they build a new warehouse or a new assembly line. If businesses increase their spending, aggregate demand curve would shift out and to the right. If the government increases its government consumption expenditures, which we know is spending on goods and services, aggregate demand would shift out and to the right. And if foreigners buy more of our goods and services, aggregate demand would shift out and to the right. As we go through this model, I've noticed that students have some difficulty with cause and effect. So if any of these things happen, it will shift our aggregate demand curve. We're going to look at our variables and notice that the variables on our model that we are looking at are different than the simple supply and demand model. And so as an end result to one of these things happening, we are going to have a new level of GDP, and we're also going to have a new price level. So one primary thing that will not cause the aggregate demand curve to shift is a change in price level. So we often think that a change in price level is going to shift one of these things, but price changes as an end result to one of these things happening. So that's what's going to shift our aggregate demand curve. What's going to shift our aggregate supply curve? Interestingly enough, one of the main things that changes our short-run aggregate supply curve is our labor productivity. So how productive people can be with the tools and skills that they have. Another main thing that contributes to a shift in our short-run aggregate supply curve is changes in input prices or input costs of production. If the price of crude oil goes up, cost to produce many things will go up, profits will go down, willingness to supply will go down. That short-run aggregate supply curve would shift backwards and to the left. Maybe crude oil prices fell. That means costs of production falls, profits increase, willingness to supply increases, and the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift out and to the right. During the midst of the Great Recession, labor productivity increased because unemployment rate was reaching 10%, and people who had jobs looked around and noticed that a lot of their colleagues were being laid off, and they did not want to be laid off, so they worked really hard. They weren't on Facebook and YouTube as much as maybe they were before, and labor productivity actually increased during that time. So if we have an increase in labor productivity, that would shift my short-run aggregate supply curve out and to the left. It will be important for you guys to memorize what things shift what curve. Okay, so yet again, as an end result, equilibrium price will change, or our price level will change. A change in price level does not cause our short-run aggregate supply curve to shift. One of these things will cause our short-run aggregate supply curve to shift, and price level will change as an end result. Okay, so let's first look at this image here. Make it a little bigger. This is an example, and then we'll come back and answer these other two questions. This is an example of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. What we see here is our aggregate demand curve sloping downward and to the right, indicating at higher price levels, holding other things constant, people don't want to buy as much. When price levels are low, people would like to buy more. Notice the difference in the variables that we're looking at. In the simple supply and demand model, we are used to seeing quantity down here. But if we're trying to understand the total economy, so all goods and services, rather than using number of units and quantity, we'll use real GDP, which is actually listed in dollars. So it's kind of odd that on our horizontal axis we have dollars listed here. And price level is listed as some unit that hovers a little bit above or a little bit under 100. It's a type of price index, and it's has a specific base year associated with it. We get to arbitrarily choose what base year we want to use, but over here on my vertical axes I have numbers maybe between 80 and 110 or something like that. So it is a bit odd that we see dollar amount down here and these price indices units on our vertical axes. What specific type of price index are we using? Because we're talking about the economy as a whole, we're not using consumer price index. That only measures what consumers, how they're experiencing price changes in the economy. We're not going to use producer price index because that only measures how producers experience price changes in the economy. We're going to use GDP deflator. So if you go back into chapter 9, you'll see our three types of price indices that we learned about. GDP deflator is looking at the price level of all goods and services produced in our economy. So our aggregate demand curve slopes downward and to the right. Short-run aggregate supply curve slopes up and to the right. It's showing at higher price levels, firms would like to produce more. At lower price levels, we have lower profits, so firms don't produce as much. And the intersection of these two curves gives us the current state of the economy. We are producing right here at Y0. So what's going on with this long-run aggregate supply curve? So this long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line, and it is indicating the amount that we can produce. We can produce this much of real GDP if we are at full employment. In other words, if we are at our natural rate of unemployment, which is our happy place of unemployment in the economy. So what are two other terms used for long-run aggregate supply? One of them is potential GDP. It's what we can produce if it's the maximum that we can produce if we're at our happy place of unemployment. The other one that I won't use, you won't see it on the test, but you might find it online or in the book, is full employment GDP. So this concept of full employment is saying we are at our natural rate of unemployment. So the next question, what is the unemployment rate when the economy is producing at our long-run aggregate supply? The answer is we are at the natural rate of unemployment, which in our country is about 4% to roughly 5%. Okay, so coming back here to how do I read the graph? If our potential, what we can produce is here, if we're at our happy place of unemployment, but where we're actually producing here, which is closer to 0, that means actual GDP is low relative to my potential GDP, which is right here. Okay, If I'm not producing as much as I potentially could, then I don't need as many people working for me, so my actual unemployment is high relative to my natural rate of unemployment, which is about 4 to 5%. So if this is the current state of the economy, maybe my unemployment rate is 6.5%. Okay, I just made that up. And then in one of our Edpuzzle videos, it talks about what term economists use to define this. If we are producing below potential, so to the left of my long-run aggregate supply, we call this a recessionary gap. Okay, so this is the situation. The economy is not producing as we would like it to. Maybe we're in a little bit of a recession or a recessionary gap where unemployment is higher than we would like, higher than our happy place of 4 to 5%. So how would a Keynesian solve this problem? How would a classical solve this problem? So Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who believes in promoting the demand side, he would suggest to solve the problem one of two ways. He would say we need to stimulate aggregate demand, and because we can't force people to go spend their money, we can't tell consumers you have to go buy pizza tonight, and we can't tell foreigners they must buy our products this month. He says we can tell our government to increase spending, so how Keynes would suggest to solve this problem is to increase government spending, which would shift my aggregate demand curve out and to the right. Or he would suggest we solve this problem by reducing taxes on businesses and or on consumers. So Keynes would do that. It would manipulate our aggregate demand curve because we would be changing personal consumption expenditures or gross private domestic investment if we manipulated taxes, cutting taxes, or it would be this G if we chose to increase government consumption expenditures. So let me copy paste the graph that I have. There we go. Showing an increase in aggregate demand, shifting it out and to the right. And so now the current state of the world is the intersection between short-run aggregate supply and our new aggregate demand. I have it right here landing on potential, which is our happy place where we want to be in the economy. Maybe the government spent too much money and we actually overshot it. Maybe they didn't spend enough and it didn't increase as much as we'd like. But an increase in government consumption expenditures or a cut in taxes will have this effect where it shifts our aggregate demand curve out and to the right. That's how Keynes would solve it. Classical economists, they believe in supply side economics, so they want the supply side to work it out. Classical economists also believe in this process known as self-adjustment, and how the self-adjustment process works is actually through manipulating wages. So if we are at this point in the economy, so we can produce this much if we're at 4 to 5% unemployment. We can produce even less right now. Unemployment is high. If unemployment stays high for long enough, some people in the world will be willing and able to accept less as an income than they think they're worth. Maybe you get out of college and you're expecting to make $55,000 a year. But when you get out of college, what if the unemployment rate is 8%? And there are a lot of people looking for jobs. And you've been looking for a job for a long time. Maybe someone offers you a job where they're offering you $40,000 a year, $15,000 less than you'd hoped you'd be worth. You might take it because you've been looking for a job for so long and because we're currently in this recessionary gap. So if a lot of people do accept it, maybe you wouldn't, but a lot of people in society would take a lower pay just so that they could have a job because the economy is not doing so great. What that does is it manipulates input prices. Wages are an input price or a cost of production for businesses. So when they get to pay people lower wages, that means their cost of production falls, their profit per unit increases, and their willingness to supply increases. So our short-run aggregate supply curve would actually shift outward and to the right. So I paste my graph in there. So my short-run aggregate supply curve shifting out and to the right. That was our original equilibrium in the economy. This is our new equilibrium. So we see we've moved closer to potential. We're now producing this amount of real GDP rather than that amount. So we're closer to potential. In both of our examples, the amount of real GDP increased. But for the Keynesian model,